A new report from the Brookings Institution, and it's called The Rise of the Futurists, The Perils of Predicting with Future Think. I actually know one of the authors, Alex Montgomery. He's a hot shit political scientist who does quant stuff, a lot of like network analysis type stuff. He's very good at what he does. This report is taking issue with basically futures studies as a field implicitly. But what they're arguing is that when people who use scenario analysis and war games and other techniques and methods of analysis that is like all part of like the futures studies canon, when they make predictions, they're doing so erringly, or they're taking on risks because they are creating expectations about the future that are not probabilistic, but what they call is like possibilistic, right? You're chasing possibilities, or you're presuming that something that's possible will be. And insofar as that's what they're arguing and that's what they're critiquing, that's correct. That's not what you're supposed to do, right? The reason why I'm flagging this is because I teach a course, which Gabby had taken on
Yeah.
the analytic tradecraft of strategists, basically. And these various tools are some things that we teach, but you know, the canon of future studies, like the core first principles are that what we do affects the future cannot be predicted, and the future is not predetermined. And everything that you do with these various tools of analysis, it's predicated on those assumptions. So if you're making predictions based on scenarios or based on anything else, you're already wrong. You're already a charlatan. The problem with this, and I'm going to teach this report in this class in the future, but my concern here is that these authors and what they're arguing for is basically positivist social science reasoning, thinking probabilistically, which is what we do in the social sciences, right? Especially if we do quantitative shit. And that's fine for producing analysis. That's not fine for deferring policy judgment. Like, you don't make decisions solely on the basis of probability, because probabilities are reflecting correlations. The causation is something that you infer, but almost never can rarely prove. And so when you've got probabilistic reasoning as part of your analytical toolkit, that's great. But when you decide to outsource your own judgment and your own critical thinking to that, or when you conflate probability and prediction, which is precisely what the fucking Nate Silvers of the world do, like this 538 shit. When you're moneyballing, you are predicting. And you're predicting on the basis of probability. And those probabilities are causally inferential. They're correlations. So that's very problematic and very, very, very common. It's like what almost everybody does in the fucking social sciences, and especially the people like the Nate Silvers who monetize this stuff. It's all converting probabilism into prediction. That's the real common problem. This report makes it sound like the opposite is true. Like, if you're making a prediction based on a scenario, that's the real problem. That's a problem. I agree with that. It's far less common. It's far less common than the norm, you know? But this is good for food for thought. And like, I don't know, if this is your bag, then it's definitely worth a read.
I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about this kind of area, and I mean, I've come across it mostly in the context of Nate Silver and 538,
yeah,
where you are trying to quantify the knowledge that you've built up, is that it's impossible to prove or disprove either way. I mean, I wonder how you assess the reliability of these kinds of resources. Like, I know you hate 538, but like, how do you assess the value of 538 when you can't prove or disprove whether it was right or wrong, because it's a non-falsifiable prediction?
Yeah, I mean, you say...
assessment of probabilities.
Yeah, so if you say something has like an 86% chance of happening, you know, Hillary Clinton has an 86% chance of winning the election or something, that's called a subjective probability. You have, and when 538 does their shit, they have a basis for generating that number, but having a basis for something doesn't make it correct. It just means here's what our reasoning is. And so there's this famous example of Nate Silver saying that like the odds of 9/11 happening were like 1 in 25,000 or something like that. And that's ridiculous. It was, I mean, by definition, it was like a black swan event, but it was this thing that you could not predict. And like most social behavior, like most international politics, you can't predict it. If we could predict war and peace, our lives, like foreign policy, would be so much easier to do. You cannot. So when you put the number on it, 86%, that's the likelihood of it happening. That's false confidence. To me, that's snake oil, because people take away, oh, it's more likely to happen than not. But the number is, for all intents and purposes, arbitrary, in the sense that it's not objective, in the sense that it is a subjective probability based on your own criteria, not some established criteria that everybody accepts, your own criteria. And then because it's statistics, generally speaking, you can show your homework, although nobody ever reads it, right? And so there are tabs on 538, the website, where you can look at their methodology and scrutinize it and critique little bits of it. And people do, but that misses the point that the whole larger enterprise of subjective probability is creating false confidence about what we would call radical uncertainty. Things that are just inherently unpredictable, but you're doing this little rhetorical magic trick where you say you're technically not predicting, but you kind of are. And then the worst part of it, or the most frustrating part of it, is that like, well, Hillary Clinton didn't win. And then Nate Silver can be like, well, I didn't say she would win. I said she had an 86% chance of winning. And so like, it's not guaranteed. It's not a lock. There's a 14% chance she could lose. And so no matter what happens, and this is the non-falsifiable thing, no matter what happens, it's like, well, that doesn't mean I'm wrong. And if she wins and that's what the probability was, you get to claim that you were a genius. So this is a fucking shell game. Everyone's getting played, and like it feeds the media, because the media loves to say, what's the number? What are your odds? Like in the nuclear crisis in 2017, I cannot tell you how many times I got asked, what are the odds of nuclear war with North Korea? What are the odds we end up in war with North Korea? What kind of fucking question is that? I always gave this convoluted answer that never got quoted, basically, that like we should worry about the risk of nuclear war with North Korea, identify the pathways to those risks, like how it happens, and then reverse engineer it, buy down those risks. That's how we should be thinking about it. Right? We shouldn't be thinking about it as like 40% chance, oh, not worried, 60% chance, oh, now I'm worried. That's all bullshit. That's all made up. And yet, most pundits were happy, fucking Richard Haas, like all these big name people who would go on like MSNBC or CNN or whatever, they're happy to say, oh, it's a 50-50 chance. Based on what, you fuck? That's the subjective probability, and it's even worse than the Nate Silver shit because there's no analytical basis for it. It's literally your fucking finger in the wind. So I don't know if that answered your question, but subjective probabilities annoy me because like literally anybody can come up with one, and it creates false confidence.